Today we're here with Roger Jackson. Roger, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Josh. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, I really like to talk to people from the West, from the United States, who were infatuated with Buddhism, and I like to ask them how they became infatuated with it. So, in my case, it was a healthy dose of psychedelics, Alan Watts, and Ram Dass. So, what was it for you? What made you fall in love with Buddhism and Eastern thought?
Well, I would agree that psychedelics had a role in it. Way back in my college days, when I probably took a little too much LSD once, and thought that I had had an enlightenment experience. And in the wake of that, however, I decided that if enlightenment really was a possibility for human beings, probably psychedelics were not the easiest or most obvious way to get at that. And so I increasingly began to think in terms of getting into some kind of a spiritual or mystical tradition. And while I was still in college, that could have been Advaita Hinduism, it could have been Zen, it could have been Taoism, could have been some version of Buddhism. And after I graduated from college, my girlfriend, now my wife, and I moved to the Bay Area and sort of spent a year working for the post office, making quite a lot of money, and sampling the spiritual smorgasbord of the era then, John Lilly, Alan Watts, Sufi dancing, whatever it might be, and decided, having saved up a bit of money, that we would go to Asia to try to study with somebody somewhere. And so we made our way back to the East Coast, visited our families there. We're both from the New York area, and then flew over to Europe on Icelandic Airways, which was as cheap in the 70s as it often is these days. Hitchhiked all through Europe, and then went overland to India by various buses and trains. Took us about a month to do it, and cost us maybe $25 in transportation. Once we were in India, we went to various spiritual locales, Rishikesh, which is, of course, a very important Hindu pilgrimage center, and Varanasi, the sacred city on the Ganges in eastern India. We went to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama was then and still is living in exile, but there was nobody around because he was down in Bodh Gaya, the most sacred place in the Buddhist cosmos, giving a big initiation. So we kind of missed out on things. Nothing really seemed to connect, and so we went to Nepal for a bit and did some trekking, and we were about to head down to South India to check out again a Hindu kind of utopian community called Auroville, founded by actually by the successor and heir of Sri Aurobindo, a very great Hindu yogi of the first half of the 20th century. But we ended up reading a brochure for a month-long meditation retreat in Tibetan Buddhism that was happening outside Kathmandu. We did that retreat. It sort of completely changed our lives and our minds. We then spent time in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama was around and where we could take classes at a library he'd founded. We went back to Nepal eventually in the fall of the same year. This is 1974, and did some more trekking, another month long retreat. And at that point, I had decided I wanted to pursue Buddhism academically, and so there was a Tibetan geshe, a very highly realized and highly educated Tibetan monk who was also a professor at the University of Wisconsin. So we moved to Madison, where I could study with him, and we also helped him to found a Buddhist center in Madison, now called Deer Park Buddhist Center, where, because of a connection between our teacher and the Dalai Lama visited many times over the years. Anyway, that's the sort of short answer, although it seems rather long, as to how I got into it. I would say that the thing, you put it in terms of infatuation, and I would certainly say that in our initial enthusiasm for Buddhism, when, as I said, it kind of turned our lives around. What struck us most about it, probably, well, for one thing, the sophistication and excuse me, and the complexity of the teachings, but also, and I think above all, the degree to which the lamas, the spiritual teachers with whom we were studying, seemed really to embody what it was they were teaching. They seemed to embody the ideal that Buddhism laid out. Now, on further reflection, even a year or so later, I recognize, well, there are plenty of Christians who embody Christian values, Muslims who embody Muslim values, Jews, Jewish values, and so forth. But for us, for whatever reason, having some suspicion of the West and Western culture in the late 60s, early 70s, it was this connection with these Buddhist teachers above all that kind of put us on some version of a path.
It's amazing. You met the Dalai Lama then? What was that like?
Well, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, it's not like we're fast friends or bosom buddies or anything like that. Some of my friends can say that, but he one of the Tibetan terms for the Dalai Lama means something like the presence, and you really do feel that in his presence. That here's somebody who is, on the one hand, he clearly uh, kind of conveys a spiritual feeling, and yet he's very, very down to earth. I mean, we've seen him in different contexts where he's giving, ritual initiations or where he's giving complex philosophical teachings. And a few years back, maybe 10 years ago, I was on a panel with him at the University of Minnesota, talking about various issues, sitting right next to him. And he kind of used me as a foil at various points. So he's very, very down to earth, very direct. And yet, and he feels, it's not only that he is a presence, but that he feels utterly present as well. And I think it's not just people like me who, of course, are predisposed, I think and perhaps feel that. But I've talked to kind of grizzled journalists. For instance, a long ago New Delhi correspondent for Time magazine who said that, and he's this guy was he was tough, but he says, I went and interviewed the Dalai Lama, and I was sort of, I sort of melted. Not everybody reacts that way, of course, but he's remarkable, and his intellect is astonishing. And even now, at what age, 87, he's still got his wits very much about him. He still gives teachings, maybe not quite as lengthy as he used to. He doesn't travel as much as he used to, but he's very much there, and we hope not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, I think I've heard a quote of his that "My life is my message," and it sounds like from your depiction of him, he definitely lives up to that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Certainly as much as any human being I've ever been around.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've written a slew of books. Your newest book being one that I have right here called
Hmm.
Rebirth.
Yep.
So among all of the subjects and topics that are covered in Buddhism, what landed you on the subject of reincarnation and
Mm.
rebirth for this newest book?
Well, it's a kind of a long story and a short story, where there's a long term answer and a shorter term answer. The long term answer is that when my wife and I first did this month long intensive meditation retreat in Nepal, and it was meditation, but it was also a lot of teachings on various Buddhist topics. The very first assertion that was made in the very first discourse by the Lama who is doing most of the teaching was, mind is beginningless. And you start to think about this, and you realize that if you've grown up in a typically scientifically flavored Western cultural context, you don't believe that for a second. You believe that the mind, if we can even say that there is such a thing, is a product of the brain, an epiphenomenon of the brain, a function of the brain, perhaps, or maybe it just is the brain, as some really hardcore types want to claim. And what's more, again, if you're not particularly religiously inclined, you're likely to believe that once we die, that's it. You know, the mind dies. So, in that sense, many Westerners, I think, came into this course or courses like it thinking, you know, your mind begins, you know, maybe when you're a few years old, arguably at birth, and it ends at death. And yet, here was a very serious and basic claim to the effect that mind is beginningless in the sense that what we are above all is a kind of continuum of mind or mental events that can be traced back before not only our birth in this life, but before our conception in this life, and can be traced back into a life before that. And in fact, lives going back infinitely before that, because in many Indian ways of thinking about the history of the cosmos, there simply is no beginning. The universe may come into existence, go out of existence, come into existence, go out of existence, but in a way, these rainbow strands of consciousness or mind that we are have no beginning, and in some ways they will have no end. So it's not just that we have lived before in some sense, but that after this life, we will likely live again, although there's an important asterisk associated with that statement, because at least in some versions of Buddhism, particularly the style of Buddhism practiced in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Theravada Buddhism, which uses the Pali Canon as its main source, the ideal actually is to put an end to mind and consciousness and to attain a state of nirvana, which may involve something like consciousness, but not consciousness as we possibly understand it. Anyway, this basic assertion at the beginning of the course was suddenly sort of blew out both ends of what I assumed was life, and particularly the life of the mind. And I took this as a kind of koan, and I honestly I didn't buy it initially, and when I kept asking the lamas, and then eventually when I moved to Madison and began asking my teacher there, Geshe Sopa, about this, they constantly referred me to a very important 7th century Indian philosophical text by a Buddhist pundit known as Dharmakirti, who in a particular chapter of his most influential work basically argues philosophically, not just on the basis of faith, not even on the basis of religious experience, but argues rationally and philosophically to the conclusion that there must be past and future lives. And so I took that as my dissertation topic, and worked on a Tibetan commentary on this particular chapter. You know, eventually finished the dissertation, which was like 1,000 pages long. Not even the longest at the University of Wisconsin, but it
Wow.
was long, and that eventually turned into a book. But then you know, at least not the whole dissertation, but at least part of it. And then I, you know, sort of went off for many years and studied other things, wrote about other things, you know, ranging from tantric Buddhism to Buddhist theology to Tibetan literary genres, to a particular interest of mine, the practice known as the Great Seal or Mahamudra, a very important Tibetan Buddhist meditative and philosophical tradition. But in, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, somebody I knew who was an editor at Shambhala Publications said that she and somebody else were putting together a kind of edited volume on secular Buddhism or secularizing Buddhism, as the title eventually became, and asked me if I'd contribute something. And because I had, even though it'd been a long time since I'd worked very specifically on these questions about rebirth, I thought, well, you know, this is clearly something that Western Buddhists struggle with a great deal. And so I said, okay, I'll write you an article that talks about sort of contemporary stances on rebirth among particularly, say, North American Buddhists. And I set out to write this. And as you may have already gathered, I tend to write long rather than short. And by the time I had finished my draft of the article, it was probably 2 or 3 times longer than it should have been. And the editor said, "Well, this is way too long for this volume. Why don't you carve out a little bit? We'll put that in the volume, and why don't you take what you have left and turn that into a little book for us." So this is about the time just before the pandemic started, and this little book turned into my pandemic project, if you will. And so I submitted it. Again, it was longer than they wanted, so it couldn't really fit into the series, but they liked it, so they published it pretty much as it was. And I submitted it in late 2020, and it came out early this spring. So that's how I came sort of, as it were, back around to Rebirth.
It's a juggernaut of a book. It is so deep. I was so surprised at how much I don't know about Buddhism and rebirth and reincarnation. I had
Mhm,
no idea the depth at which the different sects of Buddhism differ in
mhm,
their ideas of their cosmologies and rebirth.
mhm,
But
mhm.
people who are in the West who have no conception of Buddhism or what reincarnation is, uh, what do you think we're missing here? Because it seems that there's like a woo wooey sort of like magical uh interpretation of what reincarnation is in the West. So again, what are we
Yeah.
missing here?
Well, I think we're probably missing a lot, quite apart from the depths of any particular tradition when it comes to ideas like rebirth, which I should note parenthetically is not limited to Indian based traditions. There are traditions of rebirth found in many, um, sort of, as people put it, small scale societies, Inuit societies, Igbo societies in Africa, and so forth. And there's also kind of subterranean traditions of rebirth or reincarnation in some Western religions, though they're certainly written out of the main story for the most part. But I think, well, I think one of the things that often is missed, because your reference to woo woo approaches to reincarnation, um, I think one of the things that I used to, back in the day, I used to refer to this as the kind of Shirley MacLaine version of reincarnation, but that dates me a bit because I don't think Shirley MacLaine's ideas on various psychic phenomena are all that current these days. You might describe it more that what we see in the contemporary West among people is something more like a theosophical idea of reincarnation. The Theosophical Society was a very important spiritual movement that began in the 19th century in Europe with a visionary Russian woman by the name of Helena Blavatsky, who claimed to be in contact with hidden masters beyond the Himalayas who taught to her the religion behind all religions, namely theosophy. And reincarnation was very much a part of theosophy, but the notion of reincarnation in theosophy was basically what I would call evolutionary. That is, you only ever go up, you only ascend from life to life, continuing to sort of burn off karmic debts and afflictions of one sort or another. And so, the logical conclusion of this pretty quickly as well, if I've been born a well-educated, affluent Westerner in this life, wow, it's only going to get better next time. And I think this is the way still that many people do tend to think in what I would roughly call new age circles, tend to think about what they would call reincarnation. However, I think it's very clear if you even go a little ways into any of the important Asian and particularly Indian traditions of reincarnation or rebirth, that you only can understand rebirth as being part of a kind of circle. And the image that I use for this sometimes is that of a Ferris wheel, right? You go on a fair. I don't know if people go on Ferris wheels anymore, but I think everybody knows what it is. And you go on a Ferris wheel, and one time you may be up and you've got this amazing view out over the whole fairgrounds, and you think, wow, this is doesn't get any better than this. This is my destiny. But then somebody cranks the thing, and next thing you know, you're down at the bottom. And rebirth and reincarnation ideas in India are such that it is not assumed that if we have this, what we might describe as Buddhists like to describe as this kind of perfect human rebirth with so many opportunities, there's no guarantee that that will be the case next time, because where we go in this sort of circle of reincarnations or rebirths, if you will, is fundamentally dependent on our karma, that is, our actions of body, speech, and mind. And actions of body, speech, and mind, in turn, are governed to almost completely by the kinds of attitudes and understandings that we bring to everyday life. And in the analysis of most Indian thinkers, most of us, most of the time, are really quite deluded. We are fundamentally ignorant because we don't understand who we are, and therefore we don't understand what the cosmos is, what the reality behind the cosmos or within the cosmos really is. And granted, Hindus and Buddhists and Jains say will all disagree on what it is we're ignorant of, and they have some real philosophical scraps over that question. But everybody agrees that we are severely deluded beings, and that therefore we mostly have, subtly or in overt ways, mostly negative attitudes. We're governed by desire and anger, for instance, and that then most of our actions tend to be based on those. So actually, we may have this wonderful human life, but we have to check up, as my first mama liked to say, and notice what actually is motivating our actions. What is the nature of our actions? And the kind of fundamental role of karma, or the fundamental nature of karma, is simply, it's as the biblical phrase goes, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. The quality of a particular action will ensue eventually in a particular and appropriate result. So to take an example from within this life, if I, continuously insult somebody who thought I was their friend, the karmic payback for that will, at the very least, be that the friendship will come to an end, and there may be some kind of retribution from that person if they feel they've been injured seriously enough. But of course, in these systems like Hindu, Buddhist, Jain traditions, it kicks beyond this life, such that, to take a kind of an extreme but important example, if I kill some being in this life, um, even if I do it with my last breath, um, you don't get away from the karmic consequences by dying, because it will come in the next life or in some life beyond that. So all of this is a very different view of rebirth. There's no guarantee that we might not be headed some fairly dire and distressing realm. And within Buddhist cosmology, there are such possibilities. There are higher, or at least more pleasurable and powerful realms than the human, but there also are ghostly or hellish, or for that matter, animal realms that are considered far inferior to the human. So this is at least one thing that I think often people in the West miss about at least traditional Indian views of reincarnation.
So you mentioned, say, murdering someone with your last breath.
Hmm.
And I know that in the book you have mentioned that uh, on your deathbed, depending on the frame of reference or the frame of consciousness that you
Hmm.
have, it can really make a big impact on what your next incarnation or which realm your next incarnation exists in. So,
Yes,
can you make up for a
that's a
lifetime of
good.
bad karma with like a simple say spiritual awakening before death?
It's a really interesting question, because of course it evokes something like deathbed confessions in Christianity, right? That are supposed to wipe away all accumulated sin. I would say I think the answer is complicated. I think that on one level there certainly are many teachings and traditions within what I know best, which is Buddhism, to the effect that yes, the state of mind uh, as the Bhagavad Gita actually puts it in a Hindu context, the sphere of consciousness that you're intent upon at the moment of death is, to a large extent, determinative of what will happen in the next life. But, and it's a big but, you that doesn't wipe out the accumulated karmas that have come in this lifetime and previous lifetimes. And so even if you have the fortune, let's say, to be guided through the moment of death, or you simply have a beatific vision, or feel deep faith, or have something approaching an understanding of reality, though not fully understanding it, that may help with your next rebirth. But that doesn't wipe out until you're a fully enlightened being, or at least a being who is sort of destined for enlightenment, a very very high being. You don't wipe out that stuff. So it's within the context of something like Christianity, there's just one life. So if sin is removed through the grace of God at the moment of a deathbed confession, the theology is complicated here, and it's beyond my ken for sure. Um, uh, that single life way of thinking about things doesn't apply in Buddhism. So you can't, it's not like even if you sort of have a great death and have a good rebirth the next time, it doesn't guarantee you're not off the hook completely for previous karma by any means. So there's a bit less consolation there in the idea. Nevertheless, it should be said that throughout Asia, whatever culture we're talking about, Buddhists are almost always understood to be the specialists in death. Not only that they do great death rituals, if I can put it that way, but that they have kind of delved into the nature of death, the lead up to death, the moment of death, and the aftermath of death, the way almost nobody in any other tradition has. And the tradition that I'm most familiar with, because I've studied in it the most, the Tibetan tradition, is particularly famous for this. The so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, which many of your listeners certainly would have heard of, is after all a guidebook that is to be read to a deceased person for the 49 days maximal between death and the and the sort of transposition of consciousness into a new body, assuming that happens. It can be less, by the way, than 49 days, but the ritual goes on typically for 49 days when it does. That's just one example, just a way of and again, if you study in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, everybody will teach you all these death meditations, both simply reflecting on the inevitability of death, how you'll be alone at death, how you can't take anything with you, and all that standard kinds of meditations. But also, in some traditions, very specific techniques that you can perhaps master. This is particularly within tantric or Vajrayana traditions that will help you to prepare mentally and almost in a bodily way for your own death, so that when it comes, you can use the experience for your spiritual benefit. That's really what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is trying to do for people who have already died. Anyway, that's at least something of that.
So, is this sort of where the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path come in as a way of ensuring that you can sort of complete your karma and positively transcend into a rebirth that's maybe in the same realm or a better realm? And also, that sort of brings in the idea of free will.
Hmm.
Do we really have free will within the system? Because it seems like it's
Hmm.
dependent upon that.
Yeah, this is okay. Two very good questions. A little bit separate, but I also see where you're making the connection. Um, I mean, the first point is yes, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, those fundamentals that all Buddhists accept as having been taught by the Buddha in his very first discourse, 7 weeks or so after his enlightenment. Um, that's certainly the base, because what the Four Noble Truths and especially the Eightfold Path ask of us is that we have, for instance, the Eightfold Path is a matter of having right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. All these, if we follow them through sincerely and practice them, will at the very least guarantee that in a next life, as you say, we'll maybe have another human rebirth, or perhaps we'll get a heavenly rebirth of some sort. So yes, I mean, particularly for folks like us who are, it seems, in this life beginners at Buddhism, to get these moral and also contemplative basics down is absolutely key. Also, to be, especially to be generous, is a very important quality. They often say that to get a higher rebirth or even a human rebirth in the next life, if you're moral and generous, that's probably the basic prerequisite. And if there's not too much other bad stuff that comes up to, to kind of erode that, then those are kind of the basis for a human rebirth. And if you want a heavenly rebirth, then particularly adding meditative accomplishments of some sort to that is a kind of a, it doesn't guarantee it 100%, but it's a basis for it. So sort of switch uh, to the issue of free will. I mean, this is a this is, of course, one of the great philosophical questions in the Western tradition, and it probably ought to be said that it is not, in an explicit sense anyway, a big question in Indian traditions, or perhaps in other Asian traditions, because it's tricky, okay, because one of the basic, some people would say the basic teachings of Buddhism is, broadly speaking, cause and effect. It's what Buddhists will call dependent arising or dependent origination. The sort of pithiest formulation of this is simply this being, that arises. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. This ceasing, that ceases. From the ceasing of this comes the ceasing of that. This is a broad causal law about how everything operates in the cosmos, but it's particularly important in a Buddhist context in thinking about the ways in which the things we do, the things we experience, all arise through causes and conditions. Really, there's causation everywhere. And if there's causation everywhere, the logical question for a Westerner to ask is, well, then everything is cause. Does that mean everything is determined? And therefore, do we not have free will? Again, this isn't a question precisely that Buddhists often ask. You might say that I think it depends a lot on what your definition of free will is going to be. If your definition of free will is complete independence of any causes and conditions, any contingent factors whatsoever, as if you were completely isolated in some booth somewhere, then the answer is obviously no. Because who we are, our consciousness, our various mental factors, our body, our emotions, all these are constantly affected by both external and internal causes and conditions, by tendencies we bring over from the past, habit patterns. Um, but if you're going to define free will in a looser sense by saying that yes, everything does arise through causes and conditions, but right now, right in this moment, in fact, in any moment, if we have sufficient appreciation for the ways in which causation works, and from a spiritual standpoint, Buddhists will say the Buddha had it analyzed best, then we can at least say that, okay, I will determine here and now and today that I will not act out of anger, and that I will develop patience instead. And that's, okay, that's granted. You can, if you're going to analyze to a in an absolutist sense, you have to say, well, your decision to be patient rather than act angrily is itself a conditioned phenomenon. But I don't think Buddhists are absolutist about this. In a meaningful sense, there is free will. because we can, particularly as humans, the human realm is not exactly unique in this respect, but it's certainly the best of all realms in this respect because of our, at least when all things are going well, our intelligence. We're able to discern, you know, sort of skillful from unskillful actions. We're able to understand the way karma works. And if we're not sure about past and future lives, well, we can understand how it works right in this world. All of us have experiences of the way karma works in our own lives. In that sense, I would, in a looser way of understanding free will, the answer would be yes. Otherwise, it does become fatalism, and then you fall into the view that some contemporaries of the Buddha had, which is just that, well, it all just has to roll out like a ball of string, and there's nothing we can do about it. That was certainly not the Buddha's view. It's certainly not the view of most spiritual traditions, who, whatever their particular philosophical take on a question like free will. I think about Muslims, for instance, who often have a very strong sense of predetermination, predestination, and a very strong sense of God's omnipotence, and yet um, do assert free will in a meaningful sense. Because, of course, from a Muslim standpoint, if there isn't free will in some sense, then our being judged on the day of judgment is unfair and meaningless. So, yeah, anyway, maybe more than you bargained for on that, but
No, definitely answer my question 100%. And yeah, it does seem to me that any absolutist view on free will is sort of going in too far in one direction.
yeah, yeah,
But so if you complete your karma, if you do everything right in life, theoretically, you can sort of escape the cycle of death and rebirth, which is referred
yes.
to as samsara. So does
Exactly,
that mean
exactly.
that like a permanent state of spiritual realization is possible?
Well, okay, so here we get into yeah, into some tricky areas in differences within and among Buddhist traditions. So I would be a little cautious about using the phrase completing karma. I mean, I think I understand what you mean by that. In a way, though, what you want to do is because if we've just think of it this way, if we've, as was claimed that first day at that course I took in 1974, if mind is beginningless, then quite literally, there is no end or beginning of karmas that we carry along in our mind streams. So you can't exactly complete your karma, but you can transcend it. You can just sort of leapfrog out of it, out of the need to experience the results of karma. And the way you do that is by changing the way you live, the way you act, changing your emotional attitudes, and above all, changing your understanding of reality, which importantly in the Buddhist tradition involves recognizing the absence of any permanent, independent, partless self, such as was asserted by many other Indian traditions. Uh, so, so in this sense, you just sort of leave. But I think I would answer your question by saying yes, or at least cautiously saying yes. It is believed in Buddhist traditions of all sorts that it is possible to attain a state where you no longer are creating karma that will have any results. You will be in a state of perpetual spiritual realization, and then where you begin to get, this is what we would call nirvana, enlightenment, awakening, uh, liberation. There's many different terms, and they get used in various ways in various traditions. We don't want to go down into the weeds with that, but I think it is important to recognize that there is a fairly basic divide within the Buddhist world between, on the one hand, the so-called Theravada traditions of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, which, as I mentioned before, are based in the Pali Canon, a 2,000-year-old collection of supposed teachings by the Buddha. We don't know historically how much of that he actually taught. Doesn't matter. Within the Theravada tradition, in any case, the ideal is the attainment of what they call nibbana, or nirvana. And this is, as I suggested briefly before, a state that completely transcends mind, body, emotions, transcends rebirth. And the Buddha really wouldn't characterize this state, especially after we pass from this particular life in which we attained nibbana. He basically he said it's like trying to ask what happens to a fire when it goes out. Do you say it went east, west, north, south? The question just doesn't even apply. And by the same token, what nibbana or nirvana is like, he really wouldn't say. He just said that it's beyond anything that any of us can conceive. He didn't say that it's a state of absolute permanent existence. He denied that. He said it's not a state of non-existence. He said it's not both of them, and it's not neither. And it's just sort of boom. You've really got no place to hang on to, no notion to hang on to as to what nibbana really might be like. But it's clear from the context of the texts and the tradition that follows those texts that it means you don't come back. So, from the standpoint of Theravada Buddhism, once the Buddha passed into final nirvana in the life in which he attained enlightenment at the age of 35, and then he passed away into final nirvana at the age of 80. So he had a 45-year teaching career. At that point, he was not returning. He would not take birth again. And similarly, other accomplished disciples of his they didn't become Buddhas per se, but they attained this state called arhat, a worthy one, which is similarly a state of transcendent accomplishment that gets you out of the cycle of samsara and rebirth completely. Okay, so that's more or less the view in the Theravada tradition, which reflects, I think, much of early Buddhism. But we don't want to get into historical debates too much because it's complicated. But there is the other kind of main tradition of Buddhism, the Mahayana, the so-called Great Vehicle, which arose only slightly later, perhaps, than the Theravada and other earlier traditions, has as part of its sort of conceptual framework the very important idea, uh, particularly of the bodhisattva. This is a term in Sanskrit that literally means uh, a being inclined towards awakening or a being headed towards awakening. And it's a term that's used everywhere in Buddhism for a future Buddha. And in the Mahayana, in the early traditions and the Theravada, there aren't that many bodhisattvas actually, because Buddhas are very rare. In the Mahayana, on the other hand, the notion is that Buddhas are everywhere and all the time, and all of us will sooner or later become Buddhas. And in that case, if a Buddha is defined as, in effect, a future Buddha, we all must be bodhisattvas. And a key element of the bodhisattva ideal is this term in Sanskrit called bodhicitta, which means the mind of awakening or the thought of awakening. Or some people will gloss it as the altruistic aspiration to enlightenment, which is the idea that we will become enlightened, but we do it not for our own sake so much as for the sake of aiding all sentient beings. And if this means taking birth in lower realms, even once we have sufficient spiritual awareness, we'll do that. And so while the ideal in the Theravada tradition is to get out completely, the ideal, to put it over a little too simply, in the Mahayana tradition, is to hang around. But you don't hang around as someone who is deluded. You hang around as somebody who is aware and awakened and compassionate and skillful enough that you can do all sorts of things for all sorts of beings in all sorts of places and times. And it's what in Mahayana tradition is called, you attain, if the nirvana that I've described for the Theravada tradition is this complete transcendence of samsara, the nirvana that's often described in Mahayana texts is what's called non-abiding nirvana, where you no longer really abide in samsara. You're not deluded, you don't have the emotional afflictions that ordinary beings do, but you don't, on the other hand, abide just in nirvana and leave everybody else behind. So in that sense, you don't abide in either. You can go between each of them, and that's kind of the bodhisattva ideal. And eventually, you become a Buddha with your own pure land and retinue and all these things. So in that, so sort of, to bring this back to your original question, the answer is yes. There is a state of, if you will, permanent. I'm using the term permanent in a loose sense, not in a tight philosophical sense, but a state of spiritual attainment from which you will never fall. But the question, the debate among Buddhists is: does that mean completely leaving samsara behind you, such that you're no longer involved at all, or do you continue to interact with beings, involve yourself in it, act for the benefit of others, and so forth? And again, and I should add, I don't, I'm not, I don't want to caricature or overly characterize actual Theravada Buddhists, many of whom act in ways that are profoundly compassionate and loving and effective and all that. I'm only describing the kind of hypothetical ideal. There are plenty of Mahayanas who don't really act very well at all. And there are plenty of Theravadins who are, a Mahayanist might say, oh, they're bodhisattvas. So,
So if the
the trend.
ideal and the goal is to transcend samsara, does that sort of mean that rebirth is like a bad thing, so to speak?
I would, yes and no. In It is a bad thing, and I think that in the earlier Buddhist texts, it tends to be seen that way more. I would say that rebirth is a bad thing if you don't have sufficient spiritual attainment and control that you can do anything about your own rebirth. If you're reborn willy nilly, as it were, just at the whim of your karma, if you will, then that's you're taking a pretty big chance, because you don't know whether you're going to go up or down. You can think to yourself, "Oh, I've lived a very spiritual life," but we delude ourselves all the time. We don't understand our own hidden motives much of the time. So, we really can't be sure. So, in that sense, the fundamental rhetoric of Buddhism is to the effect that rebirth is something to be. You don't want to have to do it. You don't want to take rebirth. You want to be free of. Jack. I love Jack Kerouac's phrase from Mexico City Blues. I want to. This is a paraphrase, perhaps. I want to be off of this slaving meat wheel, dead in heaven. Well, he's mixing some religious images there a bit, because he was a Buddhist who was very Catholic, or a Catholic who was occasionally Buddhist. But the notion of completely getting out is definitely fundamentally there. But again, if you are a bodhisattva with sufficient realization, power, control, then rebirth is a good thing, because you can keep taking births in which you can assist beings. But this is presuming a level of attainment that probably most of us don't have at this point.
And I would say, especially if you find yourself in one of the lower realms, then a rebirth gives you the opportunity to ascend to a higher realm.
Well, that's tricky. That's very tricky, because um, if, as you raised earlier and we've discussed a little bit, the nature of a rebirth from one life into another is at least significantly dependent on the state of mind at the time of death. And if you are in, let's say, one of the hell realms, which the Buddhists endlessly delight in describing, I mean, Dante's got nothing over Buddhist descriptions of various hell realms, hot hells, cold hells, et cetera, et cetera. If you die in a hell realm, the chances are that your death there will be an angry, a fearful, a basically negative one. And so the odds actually are great that you will be born into another low realm in the next life. So it's once you're down in these realms, according to the Buddhist theory, it's really hard to get out. I mentioned in the book this wonderful game that was developed. It really is based on snakes and ladders, which in our culture eventually became something like Parcheesi. In Tibetan culture, and they have this in Korea, they have it in a number of different Buddhist cultures, but there was a game that was developed in, oh, like the 12th or 13th century in Tibet, which you could call the game of rebirth, in which you, by throws of a die, you go from one realm to another, and you kind of learn about the different realms, and you learn a lot about Buddhism along the way. But one of the one of the really illustrative moments in this game is if you get into one of these really deep hells through like throwing a six, you to get out of that, you've got to go like throw one one, two twos, three threes, four fours, five fives, and six sixes. It's going to take a while. Uh, so so it's not, again, it's not like you, sometimes people, let's leave hell out of it for the moment, right? Sometimes people in this life, this is maybe another misconception or at least a misunderstanding of Indian traditions. I can't say people are right or wrong in their thoughts about X or Y. I would just say that people will often say, well, okay, I just had this really terrible experience and I got rid of that karma. I know plenty of Buddhists who say that. Well, I purified that karma. But again, there's no end, no beginning to the karmas that we're going to have to purify. So the fact that you had an auto accident, you survived it unscathed, let's say, or even just were slightly injured. It's not like, oh, you can't watch what's coming around the next corner because you just don't know. There's just too many imponderables, too many uncertainties, and only a being with supernal vision or omniscient mind could see that, and that's not most of us. Um, so you can't really be content that by sort of getting rid of one particular karmic cause, you're sort of on the golden road to getting rid of all of them.
Yeah, and speaking of on the road to getting rid of karmic cause, it reminds me that, I am an American. My country has committed atrocities throughout the world, and I currently participate in a capitalist system that,
Hmm.
abuses people left and right. So,
Hmm.
is that sort of a representation of a collective sort of karma that we are all responsible for shedding?
In a way, yes. I mean, the whole question, and I have not researched this deeply enough to give you an answer that I'm completely confident of, but there definitely is a notion of what we might call collective karma. And so you just described something of American collective karma, which I think probably all collective karmas are kind of mixed karmas for the most part. I mean, obviously there are. Um, I'm sure I would probably agree with you on many political and social issues, but clearly to be born an American is to enjoy certain privileges and freedoms, but also, as you say, to participate in a history that does involve both being of benefit and of harm to other people, other nations, and so forth. Um, an instance that's perhaps more germane to the Buddhist world is an explanation that Tibetans will often give, karmically speaking, for the fact that the Chinese invaded Tibet in 1950 initially, and then took over completely in 1959, and sent many Tibetans into exile and oppressed many Tibetans, I think, by any objective measure. And they will say, well, as we were born as Tibetans, and this is a karmic our karmic comeuppance, if you will, for the fact that in the 8th century, an early Tibetan emperor invaded Western China and occupied the capital of China for, I don't know, a period of 50 or 60 years, maybe. And so the Chinese are just paying us back. It's a way of, we who knows, right? Whether things really work this way, but it's a way of. I mean, all of karmic thinking is really a way of helping us to gain some sense of justice. That there's some kind of justice in the cosmos. So, you might say, oh, the Chinese invade us. What do we do to deserve this? Well, you look back in Tibetan history, you say, wait, okay, we invaded China in, the middle of the 8th century. You can then debate proportionality and various things like that, but it's part of karmic thinking that insists that in effect the universe must be just, and I think this is part of almost all religious thinking. Um, but so there is a way of thinking of yourself as a part of a collective. I mean, it's not only that you can say, "Oh, I'm an American," I'm male, I'm of this political persuasion, I'm of this social class. All that is collective karma. These are all sociological categories, and Indians and Tibetans recognize social and political and other categories just the way we do. But in a kind of technical sense, it is open to question whether there is any such thing as collective karma that exists above and beyond as kind of a synergy of individual karmas. It may simply be that all of us who have been born American created particular sets of conditions in previous lives such that we all were born American in this life. And that collective karma is simply, it's a kind of an index or a way of talking about that fact. The karma is really individual. It's not like it exists in some miasma in the Akashic record or anything like that. That we are collectively. It's not like say something like a Jungian collective unconscious, maybe. And again, I'm not all that versed in Jung, so please don't push me
Yeah.
on that particularly. But anyway, I my own in my own reading of Buddhist tradition, collective karma is simply a way of talking about the fact that individuals in their own karma have found themselves in circumstances that make them parts of what we would call groups. And therefore, we talk about, oh, a group or a collective karma.
So it's not that like I share the karma of the country. It's more, or I share the karma of the group, whichever group that I want to narrow it by. It's more or less a description of where we've come from and kind of where we've ended up as an individual.
I think so. I think so. I mean, of course, who we are as Americans or males or whatever it may be, is itself something that has an effect on the way we think, the way we act. Um, so, in that sense, you could say that collective karma has its effects, but again, it's an index more than anything
Hmm.
of belonging to particular groups. And if you get down to the kind of very fine psychological and philosophical analysis of what's going on with us, I don't think, in my reading anyway, that there is some extra entity there that, oh, here's the Americanness, the category of Americanness. This is the kind of category that Buddhists as philosophers typically denied.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Well, Roger, I want to be respectful of your time, and it seems that we've hit about an hour here. I just would like
Mhm.
to ask you one more sort of multifaceted question, and that
Okay.
is, so the future of rebirth and reincarnation.
As it were. Yeah.
Yeah, we see religions with revisions, and in my opinion, Buddhism stands up um, under the scrutiny of revisions quite well. And I guess the question is, do you find that in our current state of like our physicalist paradigm, is there a way to sort of prove or have more of a collective faith in the concept of reincarnation and rebirth?
Hmm. Uh, Probably the short answer I think is no. But there's a lot of qualifications that need to be made. Again, it depends on what we mean by physicalism, right? If we There are various most philosophers of mind these days are what we might broadly call materialists or physicalists, in that their assumption is that what we call mind, and this is a point I began with, way back earlier in this conversation, the assumption is that what we call mind is a function in some way of a properly operating brain. The brain arises, starts developing shortly after conception, develops at an astronomical rate in the early years of life, uh, you know, reaches maturity at a certain age and then begins perhaps a process of decline. And regardless of whether one's decline is rapid or very long term, at bodily death, the brain will cease to function. End of mind. Uh, those are the parameters in which I think physicalists, to use that term, or materialists tend to operate. And um, it seems to me there are only a couple of ways of cutting at the edges of a view like this, if you're inclined to accept the kind of scientific paradigm, the standards scientific paradigm, and scientific reasoning. Ways of kind of chipping away at this. It's pretty hard to chip away at the certainties of, sort of hardcore physicalists or materialists, but there are a number of approaches that can be used. One of these is to argue on the basis of various kinds of religious or spiritual or just extraordinary experiences. Probably the most famous of these are instances where young children have reported experiences from supposed previous lives. This became a very interesting and fruitful topic of research, particularly by a University of Virginia scientists by the name of Ian Stevenson, who wrote a number of books on cases suggestive of reincarnation. And you might say that in a related sense, experiences people have around the time of death, people who quote die but come back, near death experiences, people who have out of body experiences. So any of these sorts of extraordinary experiences that seem, at least subjectively, to the experiencer to point to some kind of survival of the mind, the soul, call it what you will, of the death of the body or the dysfunction of the body are suggestive. Um, I would say from my point of view that these are really intriguing. A few of the cases of, particularly of past life memories, are perhaps the most striking of all. But there still are questions of whether the experiments uh, that that revolved around these particular children and their memories were rigorously enough conducted that they can stand as proof of reincarnation more generally, let alone the Buddhist version of reincarnation. So there are possibilities there. Another type of extraordinary experience that people sometimes will cite is if you will, the deliverances of deep meditative states. It's a sort of standard assumption in Buddha, not just in Buddhism, but in many yogic traditions in India, that people who are able to concentrate their minds sufficiently will naturally have memories of past lives and will be able to see what future lives might be like. In fact, this is actually two of the experiences that the Buddha had on the night of his enlightenment were exactly of this nature. But these are extraordinary experiences. They can't really be checked in an empirical way, and we have to acknowledge that mystics in other traditions have extraordinary experiences, have remarkable attainments, and may come to very different conclusions about what happens before we're born and after we die. So again, it's all suggestive and interesting, but hardly conclusive. Um, Another way of coming at this is to try to work within a sort of modern paradigm of physics, but pushing a bit toward the edges of physics. And again, I never took physics even in high school, so I'm way out of my depth here. But there are certainly approaches to physics. The late physicist David Bohm was one who who suggested this. There are other contemporary physicists who suggest this as well. And among, say, Buddhist teachers, Alan Wallace, who has a degree in physics, at least as an undergraduate, has sort of emphasized this argument to a considerable degree, that if we only want to think of something like mind as a product of the physical, then maybe we got another thing coming, because as you begin to dig in various directions, or maybe expand in various towards various horizons in physics, you begin to wonder whether actually matter is all that basic. Some physicists will suggest that actually information, or even something more like mind, is more fundamental than matter, that matter is simply a function of a kind of energy that itself may be likened to the mental, more to the mental than the sort of hard physical. And if that's the case, well, then all bets are off. But again, it has to be said, for the moment, from what very little I understand, that this is something closer to the edges of physics, and that it's certainly not the standard paradigm of physics at this point. But as we know, paradigms in physics, as in other scientists, are replaced every now and again, and so it's not impossible by any means that we may completely flip the physicalist understanding on its head. And it may turn out that Buddhists who were talking about the universe being sort of mind only, going back 2,000 years, were in some sense right about it. But again, I don't. These are only a couple of suggestions as to how you might kind of work within slash against scientific ways of approaching these things, which again are typically physicalist and kind of hardcore materialist.
Well, I'll say that I really deeply resonate with the experiential aspect of your answer because, again, to bring it all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, psychedelics and psychedelic experiences brought me to a place where I
Hmm.
can understand and appreciate the potential of rebirth and reincarnation.
Hmm.
And man, Roger, your breadth of knowledge in this topic just blows me away. I appreciate your time so much, and thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank,
Would you please just inform the audience of any place they can find you if they want to contact you?
yeah, I mean, the easiest way is by email. My email is rjackson, JACKRJACKSON, at Carleton. Carleton is CARLETON .edu. So that's the easiest way to contact me, and I'm happy to correspond within within reasonable bounds with anybody who has observations, questions, or whatever it may be. We've only scratched the surface of this, but I really appreciate the both the depth and the breadth of your questions, and have really enjoyed the conversation. And I hope your listeners have too.